For years, Mark had settled into the rhythm of his life with Martha. As 68, he often found himself marveling at how time had slipped past. Their modest suburban home was a testament to decades of shared history, a history built on routine, trust, and the occasional quiet argument that resolved itself over lukewarm coffee. They had no children, a choice they had made early in their marriage, preferring instead to focus on careers, travel, and eventually, each other. Their days were uneventful but comfortable, a slow dance that had lost its spark but not its purpose. Mark had been a carpenter all his life. His hands were calloused, a map of hard work etched into his skin, while Martha had spent years as a school librarian. Her days now were filled with gardening, reading, and weekly yoga classes, activities Mark never begrudged her for, though he occasionally wished she'd invite him to join. Their finances were stable, not lavish, but enough to keep them afloat without worry. Theirs was a life of quiet contentment, punctuated by the occasional shared glance that spoke of years of familiarity. The first time Mark noticed something unusual, it was subtle. A few extra minutes spent in conversation at the fence with Richard, their neighbor. Richard was a recent addition to the neighborhood, a widower in his early 60s, fit for his age, with a knack for fixing things and a charm that drew people in. Mark had no ill will toward him. In fact, he'd shared beers and stories over backyard barbecues with the man. But something about the way Martha lingered in his company gnawed at the edges of Mark's peace. At first, he dismissed it. After all, Martha was friendly by nature, always quick to extend kindness to others. But as the weeks passed, he began to see a pattern. Richard's name cropped up more often in conversation. She spoke of his garden, his woodworking projects, his late wife. It was innocent, or so Mark told himself. Yet, there was a lightness in her tone when she mentioned Richard that had been absent in their own conversations for years. Mark's unease deepened on a Saturday afternoon. He returned early from a hardware store run. The sight of Martha and Richard sitting close on the patio sent a cold spike through his chest. They were laughing, her hand briefly touching his arm as she spoke. It was a fleeting moment, one that might have meant nothing, but to Mark, it felt like an intrusion, a crack in the foundation of their life. He said nothing that day. Instead, he busied himself in his workshop, sanding down a piece of oak with more force than necessary. The rhythmic scrape of the sandpaper became a mantra, a way to drown out the questions swirling in his mind. He told himself he was being paranoid, letting his insecurities get the better of him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was taking root. The betrayal, when it came, was both shocking and unsurprising. Mark found himself piecing it together in fragments. A forgotten scarf in Richard's kitchen, a faint scent of cologne on Martha's sweater, and finally, the unmistakable truth laid bare in a moment of carelessness. Martha had left her phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked, with a text thread open. Mark hadn't meant to look, but the words leapt out at him, a stark betrayal etched in digital ink. The days that followed were a haze. Mark vacillated between rage, sorrow, and a numbness that felt like drowning. He'd always thought of himself as a strong man, someone who could weather life's storms. But this was a tempest he hadn't prepared for. He moved through the house like a ghost, the silence between him and Martha heavier than any argument could have been. She knew he knew. The tension was palpable, yet neither of them spoke of it, the unspoken truth festering like an open wound. Mark's mind began to churn with thoughts of retribution. He'd spent his life building things, houses, furniture, a marriage. But now, all he wanted was to dismantle, to tear down the facade that had been their life. The betrayal had cracked something deep within him, and he knew he couldn't move forward without addressing it. Revenge became his focus, a dark companion that whispered in his ear as he planned his next move. The days after learning the truth were a blur of anger, sadness, and something worse, a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. I couldn't stop seeing her face, hearing her laugh, imagining her with him. Martha, the woman I trusted for over 3 decades, had betrayed me, and not with some stranger. That might have been easier to stomach. No, it was Richard, the neighbor, the man who'd shared beers with me over summer barbecues. It was personal. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of what had happened. My mind raced as I replayed every interaction, every moment that now seemed laced with deceit. The way she smiled at him, how she lingered at the fence when they talked, the errands that seemed to take just a bit too long. It was all so clear in hindsight, and I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. That Tuesday morning, I decided to confirm my suspicions. Martha had mentioned she was visiting a friend. I told her I had a job out of town, so she wouldn't expect me back. After she left, I waited a few minutes, then parked my truck a block away and walked back to the neighborhood. My heart was pounding, each step heavier than the last. I didn't want to see what I was about to see, but I knew I had to. I approached Richard's house quietly, sticking to the side where the window overlooked his kitchen. Peering in, I felt my stomach drop. There they were, sitting close at the table. His hand brushed hers as she laughed, her head tilted just so, the way she used to laugh with me. It wasn't overtly intimate, but it didn't need to be. I knew. I turned away, bile rising in my throat as I stumbled back to my truck. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Rage, humiliation, grease. They all swirled together, leaving me shaking. I drove aimlessly for hours, the betrayal replaying in my mind like a broken record. When I finally returned home, Martha was already there, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The sound grated on me, a painful reminder of how easily she could pretend everything was normal. I said nothing, just nodded when she asked about my job, and went straight to my workshop. It had always been my refuge, and now I needed it more than ever. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't look at her without feeling a surge of anger. I kept my distance, retreating into the silence. But my mind was working, plotting. I couldn't let this go unanswered. Richard had to understand the consequences of his actions, and so did Martha. I began watching them more closely, noting every interaction, every subtle cue that confirmed what I already knew. It was a week later when I saw my chance. Martha had gone out again, and I knew exactly where she was. I walked to Richard's house, my fists clenched at my sides. When he answered the door, the surprise on his face was almost satisfying. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't give him the chance. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He backed into the living room, his discomfort palpable. I laid it all out, every detail I'd observed, every moment of betrayal I'd pieced together. My voice was low, steady, but each word hit like a hammer. He tried to deny it at first, but his stammering only confirmed his guilt. I didn't hit him, though God knows I wanted to. My words were in us. By the time I was done, he looked like a man who'd been stripped bare. I left him there, standing in the wreckage of his own making, and walked home with a strange sense of calm. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a start. Back at home, Martha was waiting for me, her smile as bright and fake as ever. She didn't know yet that I'd taken the first step in dismantling the lies she'd been living, and when the time came, she would feel the full weight of what she'd done. I'd make sure of it. The moment I saw them together in his house, every suspicion I had was confirmed. But what I saw was just the beginning. The anger, the betrayal, the sense of humiliation, it all boiled over, but I held it inside. I had to see it through, to know the depths of their deceit, no matter how much it hurt. It happened a week later. Martha had gone out again, another one of her errands. This time I followed her. I knew where she was going. I had seen enough to predict the patterns. Parking a safe distance away, I watched her enter Richard's house. The casual way she moved, like it was second nature, like she belonged there, made my blood run cold. I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the damp grass as I approached the side of the house. The curtains were drawn in the living room, but the window to his study was slightly open, the faint sound of their voices drifting through. My heart pounded as I edged closer, the pulse in my ears drowning out everything else. The air seemed heavier, each breath harder to draw as I prepared myself for what I might see. The first thing I noticed was the laughter, soft, intimate, the kind that people share when the world outside doesn't matter. Her laugh, the same one that had once been reserved for me. My hands clenched into fists as I moved closer, peering through the narrow gap in the curtains. They were. Richard stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, his posture relaxed and confident. Martha was perched on the arm of his chair, leaning in as she spoke, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a scene so casual, so unassuming, that it might have seemed innocent to an outsider. But I wasn't an outsider. I saw the way her fingers lingered, the way his gaze lingered on her face. It wasn't innocent. It wasn't innocent at all. My breath hitched as I watched her lean in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered something I couldn't hear. He laughed, a low, intimate sound, and set his glass down on the table. Then, with a smoothness that made my stomach churn, he pulled her onto his lap. She didn't resist. She didn't hesitate. She just melted into him like she belonged there. Time seemed to slow as I watched them. Every kiss, every touch, every smile was like a dagger to my chest. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. This wasn't just a fleeting indiscretion. This was something deeper, something that had been building right under my nose while I'd been too blind to see it. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, my emotions warred within me. Anger burned hot and fierce, but beneath it was a deep, aching sadness. This was the woman I'd built a life with, the woman I'd trusted implicitly, and now, here she was, sharing herself with another man in ways that were meant for me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, broken, but I also felt something else, resolve. Eventually, I couldn't watch anymore. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking, my chest tight. I walked away from the house. each step heavy with the weight of what I'd seen. When I reached my truck, I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process everything. The rage was there, simmering beneath the surface, but I knew I couldn't act on it. Not yet. Over the next few days, I kept my distance from Martha. I couldn't look at her without seeing her in Richard's arms. Her every word, every smile, every gesture felt like a lie. But I didn't confront her. I wasn't ready. Instead, I focused on planning. They had made a fool of me, and I wasn't going to let that go unanswered. I started gathering information, piecing together the details of their affair. Every time she went out, I noted the time, the place, the patterns. I wanted to know everything, not because I needed more proof. I already had that, but because I wanted to be in control. They'd taken that from me, and now I was taking it back. One evening, I followed her again. This time, I didn't park down the street. I pulled into Richard's driveway, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't care if they saw me. I wanted them to know I was there. The look on Richard's face when he opened the door was almost worth it. His confidence faltered, his smile slipping as he took in my expression. "Mark," he said, his voice uncertain. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I pushed past him into the house, my eyes scanning the room until I saw her. Martha stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the three of us stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Then, without a word, I turned and walked out. I didn't mean to say anything. The damage was already done. As I drove home, the anger began to fade, replaced by something colder, sharper. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. They thought they'd gotten away with it, but they were wrong. I wasn't a man to act impulsively, but I wasn't a man to let a betrayal like this go unanswered, either. They would regret what they'd done. Of that, I was certain. I sat in the dim light of my workshop, my hands trembling as I ran a rag over the surface of a piece of unfinished wood. The rhythmic motion of polishing seemed to steady my mind, but even as my hands moved mechanically, my thoughts churned. My life, the one I had spent decades building, was unraveling before my eyes. The betrayal had cut deep, too deep for me to ignore, too profound for me to simply forgive. I thought about Richard, my neighbor, my friend. Where had he been nothing more than an opportunist, waiting for the right moment to claim what wasn't his? I had trusted him, shared stories and laughs with him over countless beers, and now that trust felt like it had been broken beyond repair. The betrayal had been twofold: the woman I had loved and the man who had pretended to be my ally. I couldn't decide which one hurt more. The days since I had confronted Richard had been agonizingly slow. Each time I saw Martha, I felt the gnawing emptiness inside me grow. Her smile, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a lie. Her presence, once a source of warmth, now seemed to suffocate me. I couldn't bring myself to look at her without seeing the images of her with Richard, her laughter, her touch, the way she leaned into him like she never had with me. The anger had subsided into something colder. I was no longer consumed by rage. Now, I was consumed by a quiet, methodical resolve. I had been wronged, and I wouldn't let this go unanswered. I had spent years building things: my home, my career, my relationship with Martha. But now, it felt like I was going to have to tear it all down, slowly, piece by piece. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, I pulled out the letter I had written. It was precise, calculated. There would be no room for negotiation. I wasn't going to beg for an explanation. I wasn't going to ask her why. She knew why, and now, I was going to make sure she understood the weight of what she had done. The next morning, Martha had barely spoken to me. The tension between us was suffocating, but she didn't seem to acknowledge it. She moved around the kitchen, humming to herself like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. Her nonchalance only made my blood boil, but I said nothing, watching her out of the corner of my eye as she prepared breakfast, all the while keeping my emotions carefully guarded. Martha had no idea that today would be the day everything changed. Today, I would expose the truth, and it would all come crashing down. I didn't need to confront her right away. I didn't need to scream, or shout, or accuse her directly. All I needed was to watch her face when she realized that I knew everything. When I made her face the consequences of her actions. The moment arrived just after lunch. She had gone out again, probably to see Richard. I knew her schedule by now, knew where she would be. It wasn't hard to keep track of her when she was so predictable. I sat in the living room, waiting, and as the clock ticked, my resolve hardened. There was no turning back now. When Martha returned, she stepped inside, humming that same familiar tune. She froze the moment she saw the letter on the kitchen table. My gaze met hers, and for a moment, I thought she might say something, anything to break the silence. But she didn't. She just stared, the color draining from her face as she realized what I had done. I didn't have to say a word. The letter spoke for me. The truth was in black and white, and it was now unavoidable. She couldn't hide from it. I watched her shoulders slump, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of what she had done settled on her. I didn't move. I didn't try to comfort her. I let her process it, let her feel the consequences of her betrayal. I wasn't here to make her feel better. I wasn't here to fix things. I was here to make sure she knew that I had seen through the lies, through the facade she had built. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe she would beg for forgiveness. Maybe she would apologize and promise things would change. But I wasn't interested in her apologies anymore. The damage had been done, and I knew it could never be undone. And as she stood there, silently staring at the letter, I knew I had made the right choice. This was just the beginning. The silence in the house was oppressive, a heavy weight that pressed down on everything. There was no escaping the truth now. The gulf between us had grown wide, and no amount of words could bridge it. What was left to say? The trust that had once held us together had eroded, and the woman standing before me was no longer the one I had spent my life with. She was a stranger, someone who had shattered everything we had built. She had been searching for something in the arms of another man, something that was no longer present in our marriage, and I had watched it unfold. The bitterness of the betrayal settled deep inside me, the sharp, cold edge that made it impossible to even look at her without seeing them together. I watched her try to steady herself, but it was clear she was only pretending to have control. Her fingers trembled, betraying the calm she was trying so desperately to maintain. The space between us felt unbearable. I could still smell the faint scent of her perfume in the air, that fragrance that had once comforted me, now twisting my insides. She stood frozen, unsure of how to act, but I was beyond any attempt at reconciliation. I had reached a point where anger no longer held sway over me. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind an emptiness I could not ignore. This was not a moment for confrontation or for hurtful words. The damage had already been done. The truth was out, and it was too late for apologies. What was left was a cold certainty. Our lies had come to an end. She could try to fix it, try to explain it, but none of it mattered anymore. The years we had spent together, the intimacy we had once shared, now seemed like a distant memory. I saw the same woman I had loved, but she had become a ghost, someone who had betrayed me and herself. She was someone who had chosen him over me, and that was the wound I couldn't heal. The realization that it was over settled into my bones like a slow, inevitable ache. I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of guilt, but it was nothing compared to what had been lost. What she had done wasn't just an infidelity. It was the dismantling of everything we had worked for, everything we had promised to one another. I could no longer love her the way I had before. It was as if the love I had once known had been extinguished, leaving only the cold emptiness of betrayal in its place. She wasn't the woman I thought she was anymore, and I wasn't the man I used to be, either. I had been shattered, but now, there was nothing left but the pieces scattered across the floor of a life we had built together. The warmth and tenderness we had once shared felt like a cruel joke, a lie we had told ourselves for years. There was nothing left to fight for, no reason to cling to the past. The air between us grew thicker, suffocating, as I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't need to look back. I had already accepted that we were done. Everything we had was gone, and there was no getting it back. There was no turning back now, not for either of us. What remained was the aftermath, the quiet realization that it was over, and I would have to find a way to live in the wreckage. Outside, the world continued on, oblivious to the collapse of everything I had known. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had to move forward, leaving behind the woman who had once been my wife and the man she had chosen over me. The intimacy we had shared had been destroyed, replaced by something harder, something cold. And though I walked away, I knew that nothing could ever fill the emptiness she had left behind. The days following that confrontation were a blur, and yet every moment felt like an eternity. I could no longer stand the sight of her. She was still in the house, but she wasn't the woman I had once loved, the woman who had broken everything between us. The woman who had turned everything I knew into ashes. The house was still the same, but it felt foreign now. Everything in it seemed to mock me. Our pictures on the walls, the furniture we had chosen together, the remnants of a life that no longer existed. I could barely breathe when I looked at her. She would try to approach me, to speak, to apologize, but I wouldn't let her. Words had lost their meaning. I couldn't stomach hearing her voice, not when everything she had said had been a lie. I had to make her understand, make her feel the weight of what she had done. I had to make her see what she had lost. She was still in the house, walking around like a ghost, pretending that everything was fine, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. I could see the way she was waiting for me to break, to cave in, forgive her. But that wasn't going to happen. Not now. Not after everything. The tension between us was suffocating. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of our fractured marriage hanging over us. She knew she had crossed a line, but I wasn't going to let her off easy. I wasn't going to let her pretend like this was just some mistake and slip up. This was a betrayal that ran deeper than anything I could have ever imagined. She tried to approach me one evening, her steps hesitant, her eyes searching mine for something, anything that would tell her I still cared. But there was nothing. I felt nothing for her anymore. Not love, not affection, only anger. And it was that anger that led me to act. I grabbed her arm, more forcefully than I intended, but I needed her to understand. She froze, her eyes wide with shock and fear, but I didn't care. She had done something far worse than any physical act could ever be. I wanted her to feel the same helplessness I had felt when I found out, the same crushing realization that everything we had was gone. I wanted to take her out of the world I had once shared with her, to show her that the life we had built was over. I dragged her into the living room, the weight of my grip firm, my hand almost trembling with the fury that burned inside me. She tried to speak, to apologize, but I cut her off. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to listen to her pathetic excuses, her feigned remorse. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything. I threw her down onto the couch, the sudden movement taking her by surprise. She looked at me with wide, scared eyes, and for the first time in days, I could see her vulnerability. It didn't matter. She had lost her place in my life, and I was going to make sure she knew it. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but I wasn't done. I moved toward her, my body towering over hers, and I made her face the truth. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed, not after what she had done. She had torn apart the trust, and now she had to feel the full weight of it. Her breathing was shallow, her body tense as she flinched, but I didn't stop. The rage inside me had to be released. I needed her to understand the depth of her betrayal, to feel the pain that had consumed me. Her tears didn't matter. Her apologies didn't matter. She had done this, and she would have to live with the consequences. I stepped back, my chest heaving, my hands clenched at my sides. I was shaking now, not from anger, but from something colder, something more final. She had chosen him, and now I was choosing to let her go. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there. I could hear her sobs behind me, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The life we had once shared was gone, and all that remained was the cold reality of what she had done. And it was enough. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.